This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy podcast. I'm agronomist Brian Shrader, representing the east side of the state of Indiana, joined as always by my co-host Carl Joern from western Indiana and eastern Illinois. Good morning, Carl.
Hey, Brian Shrader. How goes it?
Not bad. A little bit of field activity in the last few days. I wasn't able to join you and Ben for the last episode, but we've had a little bit of activity in between rain showers. Percentage of planting in my part of the world is very low, as we discussed as we were getting ready to record today. So I'm hoping that we miss some showers here this week of the 29th and are able to really get rolling here at the tail end of the week is my hope. And so, but it's been very slow progress at this point. What about yourself?
Yeah, same, similar story over here. We are ballpark 5% done on corn, maybe 15% done on beans, depending on locale. Certainly the area that I represent is less than that. But as you zoom out, we're probably around there planning progress wise. It's super variable though, depends on the operation. Some have not turned a wheel yet. And others are done with beans and have a large share of corn in the ground. And it's impressive to look at how folks manage and mitigate risk as they evaluate planting windows and picking their spots. And a lot of it, as we've talked before, comes back to scale and the need to get across acres versus the choice to get across acres.
Yeah, I heard an interesting interview, and I'm sorry I can't give credit where credit is due, but they were talking to an individual, and the individual said, you know, I'm in an area where 24-row planters would not necessarily be the common thing, but his justification for large equipment in areas with smaller fields was that I can wait and be patient for a few more days. And then I can go in and I can really get a lot done. And so I thought that was an interesting way, to your point on scale, of how to look at it. I'd not necessarily thought about it that way before, but it was an interesting way to think about how you do mitigate risk and manage your own farming operation. And that was just one way. I'm certainly not advocating for everybody, you know, with 30-acre fields to buy a 24-row planter, but it's an interesting idea, and it apparently works well for this grower. And so that was another podcast that I was listening to, maybe a reel somewhere. I want to try to give some credit just because it's not my original thought. So
that's okay.
That's a pretty interesting way to think about it. And so I guess two things around where we're at right now, Carl. We are recording today on the 29th day of April for our typical Wednesday release. As you mentioned, we do have areas where there are individuals that have a fair amount done, but like you and I both, we've got large stretches of the geography that we cover that are not quite where they would like to be for this time in April or the start of May. I guess some of the coaching that you're providing to both your Pioneer sales reps and to your growers in the area around when to throw the hustle switch, if you will, as we approach the beginning of May. So what's your coaching in terms of planning recommendations and things like that?
Yeah, I think as this drops on May 1st, happy May Day to all those that are celebrating. This is the point in time where we really start going in earnest. In my area, April planting does take place, but it isn't until the calendar turns to May when everybody has gotten in the field or is about to. You know, that first week of May, second week of May oftentimes is our optimal, yields, especially on the corn side of things. You really see a lot of folks that are pleased with their crop as they reflect back on those first couple of weeks of May. In terms of how I'm advising folks, right now, there's a lot of yield potential that still sits in the bag that is, in your shed, and there's nothing that we can do besides screw it up from here. And so don't get too eager and mud something in, because if we start wrong, we can't grow right. And so
Right.
It's just really important to be patient Wait until field conditions, arise to a level of being fit. Once we get to the back half of May, then perhaps we can start considering less than ideal seeding conditions, but we're not there yet. And so I'm really trying to keep folks in the mindset that we have a plan, we have a great plan. There's no need to make any amendments to that plan until maybe we hit the third or fourth week of May. And at that point, we could start considering moving some stuff around, or making adjustments. But at this point, the plan is still great. The yield potential is still exceptional. What we need to do is get it in the ground in good conditions. What about yourself, Brian? Anything that I missed there?
Not really, very much the same. I think one of the things that we think about is a year ago in 23, we had this great early stretch where some folks maybe slow rolled it, if you will, because it was a little cooler. We just weren't sure, but we didn't have any soil moisture to speak of, very little subsoil moisture. We looked like we were setting ourselves up for a very similar type of
Sure.
situation here in 24. I think that week after Easter, I think there were a lot of folks that were really geared up, ready to go that week. And then we got rain the week of Easter, and that changed things. And so I think it was a little bit, we're in a situation where we all expected to have a good chunk of the crop in the ground already.
Yep.
But I agree with you completely. If you look at the 20-year average on planting progress, we're not honestly that far off from average right now. To your point, some of the best corn yields that we've had over the last 15 years or so have come in these first couple weeks of May. I actually went back and looked at planting progress by average yield for the state of Indiana.
Yeah.
There's no real discernible difference. The years where we had a very ultra early planting window, if you will, weren't necessarily the highest yielding years, but they also weren't the lowest. And so by any chart, use the replant chart that you and I are familiar with and use on a pretty regular basis with folks, we've got plenty of time to get optimum yields yet. And so I think patience is the virtue that we have to cultivate for the next couple weeks. We're going to get there. We always do. As we mentioned, larger equipment helps do that. It's pacing, it's scale, all of those things. But if you're a person that's out there and you're listening to our podcast and you're concerned about the date, please don't be. There's still plenty of time. I agree with Carl. Let's not do anything rash. Let's make sure soil moistures are in good shape. And then the other thing too, I know that as we get into May, folks will start to ask some questions about, I've got some 115, 16-day hybrids. Maybe that's 2 or 3 days, a little bit later than I normally would. Should I change those out? And I've looked at the growing degree units to black layer. I've compared that to the 30-year average here recently. We're still in very good shape from a weather standpoint, Carl, to be able to get those hybrids in. And if we have a average weather year, we should be in good shape with even what folks would consider their late season hybrids, regardless of where we're at in the state.
Yep, you and I are on the same page. Even ultra full season corn, fuller than that. There's a couple popular numbers in there, running the same numbers. As long as you're okay picking 25% corn, you should feel very good about the next couple 3 weeks here to go ahead and get that in the ground. So we'll be sure to shoot up a flare when we're getting out of bounds. But by all means, we're in a good spot.
Oh, for sure. Yep. But I want to pivot a little bit. Maybe the topic of the day I want to talk about is it did last week dip down into freezing temperatures. We had a few mornings where things were pretty decently white, I would say. So we know that has an impact on some things in terms of cropping systems. And so I thought I'd just ask you unfortunately or fortunately deal with this on a pretty regular basis because of the sand and how fast they can change temperature. And so I thought we'd just get into this briefly for our listeners who may have had a crop in the ground at that time, or also I think it's worth some discussion on wheat as well. But talk to us a little bit about what you experienced. I know you were a little bit cooler even than I was, a little bit south there last week. So what were the conditions that you had, and are you seeing any ill effects of any of that?
Yeah, I was going to say a fun subject, a cool subject is maybe more appropriate here.
Nice.
Thank you. But in terms of evaluating, your crop as it stands in the field or as it sits there as seed, just to Brian's point, 32 degrees is when we get to freezing. The impact on a lot of, plant tissue isn't until you get a little bit below that. And the concept here, right, is once water freezes, once you turn into ice cubes, you're going to blow apart the cell walls of the plant tissue. And that is what leads to, the wilting and the necrosis, the death of those plant cells. And so if we, and you've got a very sensitive crop, in terms of its growth stage, like an emerging soybean that hasn't been quote unquote hardened off, meaning you don't have thickened cuticles on the leaves because you're pretty tender and you're still getting up and going. Those plants can be sensitive to colder temperatures. Now, it's not just how cold it gets, but it's for how long. And in order to really put a fine rule to it, it's tough because it's different depending on, just like you said, Brian, soil types, the ability of how long can that growing medium of soil retain heat. And then once we start to give that heat back into the atmosphere, that means that we're going to take on more cold than what we would if we had, a wetter soil, a darker soil. Same deal with residue. If you've ever been in this situation where there's been a cold snap, down around freezing or lower, you will notice that an emerging soybean plant that is next to a corn stalk, that stover from last year, it's more likely to die than that of the, piece of the field that is more open. And that again just comes down to, reflecting the sun's energy. And so if we're not absorbing that heat, that means we're more likely to hold on to the cold in those spots. So a long way of saying, we're going to find out this week how things look. Reports that I've heard on the couple of fields that I got my eyes on at the end of last week going into this freeze. So far, they're good as of yesterday, but the idea is that we want to wait about 5 days before we really evaluate any type of frost damage. And the reason for that, as I ramble here, Brian, is that if you go the morning after it's cold, well, the plant hasn't had enough time to show you if it's dead or alive, right? It might have darker tissue to it. It might be wilting over, but you don't know if it's going to bounce back or if it's going to lay flat. And so by giving it 5 days of time, that should be enough where we'll see, new growing points emerge, or we're going to see the death of the plant and it's just laying there and, in a pile of itself. So those are a couple thoughts on beans, but I'll let you make this more of a discussion oriented show than me just talking.
Well, you hit on it. I think the duration, the amount of time, typically the number that I think about, if you look at most crops, 28 degrees is really kind of lethal, let's say, for temperature. Yep. But it's 28 degrees and for how long, Carl? And I think that's the key thing. And whenever you get into these types of environments and you start to pull temperature records, whether it's from your own personal weather station or you go to the local weather station, don't just look at the low temperatures. A lot of those will show you the low, but we need to know how long it was at that period, because if it was just pre-dawn 28 degrees for 10 minutes, probably not going to see a lot of impact, what you've described here. On the other hand, if it was 28 degrees for 4 hours, we're going to have a lot of issues. And so whenever you go to track this, it's really important to make sure that you recognize what the duration of those temperatures were, because that will make all the difference in the world. 28 degrees for 10 minutes, probably not an issue. 28 degrees for 4 hours, that's a lethal dose of temperature by any account, or typically at least.
Yes.
You mentioned a lot of things that impact it. For my money, residue is mulch, if you will. I mean, we talk about this, in home plants, folks with, mulch and things like that. That's essentially what your residue is serving as in your field. That stover is a mulch and can help quite a bit. I've seen some really interesting situations where you would have expected to see cooked soybeans, and you don't, because that mulch held enough heat that you didn't have any problems.
Oh, interesting.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
See, my experience oftentimes is a little bit to the counter, but again, it does depend on the growth stage of the soybean plant and how cold you do get and for how long, right?
Right.
It's one of those where you you talk about the vulnerability of the soybean plant. It's as it's coming out of the ground with the cotyledon still buried. The hypocotyl is trying to pull the seed leaves out, and if we go ahead and we let them sit there, you got all that sensitive tissue. And the growing point is it's if we saw off the hypocotyl there, that little bit of soybean stem, there's no coming back from that. But if
Right.
the soybean is emerged and you have two cotyledons up, or if you're far enough along, you have a unifoliate, well, we can afford to lose a cotyledon, two cotyledons. We could afford to lose the unifoliate because
Yes.
we got three growing points that are available to us to continue to bounce back. So it again, it all comes back to how cold it was, for how long, the growth stage of the plant itself, and this is talking on beans in particular. Corn, you're fine. Growing points below ground.
Right.
It's going to stay there until you reach about 4-leaf, 5-leaf corn before it starts to come up above the soil line. So all of this, Brian, as you think about um, the risk of frost, the risk of freeze, it's all in balance with optimizing planting dates, right? In beans, we know the earlier we plant them, the longer they can find themselves in the reproductive stages. When you're at I think, is it the solar zenith? Is that when you got the peak amount of sunlight during the growing
Sure.
season? So
Yeah.
if you're flowering at that point, that means you're going to capture more daylight. More daylight means more photosynthate. More photosynthate means more yield potential to feed out those beans, as long as you get that August and September rain.
Right. Yeah.
But there's a reason why we don't plant beans in January. There's a reason we don't plant beans in February, because if they
Right.
get up and going, to optimize the amount of solar radiation, and then they get frosted off because the growing point's above ground, well, we lost all that yield potential. So there is
Right.
that balance of when to get going and when to wait. And it's like anything, it comes down to how comfortable are you with risk? Are you looking at a 1 in 10 years type of late freeze event? Are you looking at what's the average, and based on those dates for your own locale and your own production system? Because again, you've got 28 degrees in a no-till situation could look very different than 28 degrees in a conventional till system.
Yep.
It's a complicated subject, and that's what allows you and I to stay gainfully employed.
Fair enough. This other thing that you have to think about too is you're playing a game of averages with the last frost date as well. That's the other thing. I mean, certainly, some years your last frost is very early. I actually went to our friends at MRCC, the Midwestern
Yep.
Regional Climate Center. We've talked about them before, but they have a really great map that, if you're not familiar with, I know Carl and I use a great deal. Ben uses it as well on a pretty regular basis, that you can pull up and you can take a look at growing degree unit accumulation. While you were explaining there, I thought I'd just go real quick, pull it up. It shows that for my location where I live here
Yeah.
in north of Upland, Indiana, that April the 8th is actually the average last freeze. However, it's interesting that we actually have some frosts that have actually been significantly later. In 1988, as an example, the last frost was the 26th day of April. And
Okay.
there actually is this really interesting one that I had forgotten about until I scrolled over here. But the last freeze in 2020 was May the 10th. And I had
Yep.
forgotten about that. But now, when I pulled that up, I remember having some issues that I needed to go look at. So,
Yep. Yep.
and for my money, you mentioned the corn being below ground and not having any issue because the growing point is there. But for my money, to walk into a cornfield that has been frosted off, it just looks much worse than a soybean field frosted off. The corn just oftentimes is just completely flat on the soil surface. It has just melted to almost flat, where the beans, just because of the way their integrity works, they're just kind of limp and laid over. They're typically not flat. They will eventually turn black oftentimes if they are completely frozen. But to look at a cornfield that has been frosted, or areas of a cornfield that has been frosted, you just can't imagine that it will ever turn into a beautiful field of corn again. But it does almost without exception. But it can be a very scary looking thing if you walk out into a cornfield and everything's just flat on the soil surface. So
Yeah, a fun aside on that, Brian, just to chase a squirrel, you talk about how it kind of melts down. There was a time in seed production, and depends on who your brand provider is, not ours, but others, that will try to mimic that same concept of frosted corn, because it is going to delay the maturation of that individual plant. And so what they do is they'll take propane and they'll make their own flamethrowers, and they will flame male inbreds to delay them. The same concept as a frost. You'll plant the
sure.
field, you'll plant your females and males at the same time, but in order to reach the nick that optimal for pollination, there are some companies that will still use, they'll still flame their inbreds,
Okay.
whereas we elect to use, planting delays based on how
Sure.
we understand the optimal, pollen shed. But you can, and I haven't seen this in years, but when you do get frosted off corn, sometimes you can run into, snafus, like a little buggy whipping to it,
Yep.
because if that tissue hasn't completely deteriorated, and as you try to, bring up new leaves through the whorl, it can get caught in that older,
Yes.
frosted off tissue. So that can make it a pain. But to your point, oftentimes we just keep on trucking it and it looks
Yep.
fine. Go away for a
Absolutely.
while and it'll look great.
But again, that goes back to, as you mentioned, it does take a little bit of time. You're going to evaluate a frost field. 5 days is typically my rule of thumb after the frost to go take a look at it. You're going to have some idea, especially in a soybean field, at least in my estimation, a rough idea of what you think your population is going to be. But you're probably going to have to come back and visit a field again in 5 days, maybe a few more than that, maybe a full week, to really get a sense of what kind of overall damage you're going to have, because you're very rarely going to have a frost event this time of year where it's going to wipe out an entire field. It's going to be areas of a field, as we've already mentioned, because of residue, soil type, topography, whatever it might be. It's very rarely are you going to see a corner to corner type of destruction level because of the frost.
Yep. Spot on.
So, Carl, certainly, I think one of the things that we probably should touch on as well when we talk about this frost and freezing temperatures is damage to potential wheat. Obviously, we're starting to get into a pretty key period for wheat production in terms of where we're at with the Feek scale currently. Would be curious your thoughts on whether we will probably see any issues with our wheat crop because of this frost event that we had.
I'll keep it short. No, Brian. But I'll go further into depth here.
Sure.
The wheat in our area, that's it, that jointing stage. You can find a node, if you will, or a couple nodes. That should all be fine.
Yeah.
In theory, wheat is hardy down to 24 degrees at that growth stage. Now, as you
Yep.
continue to progress in wheat maturation, then it becomes less and less resilient. Just, it makes sense, right? Your reproductive
Right.
structures, they're more fragile, and so they can succumb to more mortality, or perhaps it's an issue with the hormonal balance in the plant. As it's like a teenager, right? If you want to go ahead and mature into a full-fledged adult, there's going to be some hormones coursing through your body to change your anatomy and all that stuff. So that's what's going on in a wheat plant during the reproductive stages. We're early on here. Southern part of the state, perhaps you're closer to flag leaf, boot stage. I don't think we've got any stuff heading out yet. But down there, you're looking at more of a 28-degree sensitivity for wheat. And same concept. Flag leaf south, that means we are developing those reproductive plant structures, so they're more sensitive. That's why you go from 24 to 28 degrees. But again, where we experienced the cold, it was to the north. We didn't sweep all the way down to the south where we was at that fragile stage. So in long, that's the explanation. In short, no, I wouldn't expect to see any wheat issues this year.
I either, and again, as we mentioned to start out with, my comments around duration of the temperature for wheat is a very key metric as well for whether or not you're having significant impact on potential yield. So just keep that in mind as you get ready to evaluate. If you're not seeing any abnormal coloring on the leaves or the plant, my guess is you probably will not see any issues at all. But if you've got some wheat that's discolored, it might be worth a phone call to your local agronomist or your local sales rep, just as a quick walkthrough to evaluate, just to be sure that everything is in good shape.
Yeah. To your point, you talked about 2020, and I can remember us taking a look at some wheat fields that year where you did have the florets, the glooms that, they got bleached white because it got so cold.
You bet.
And at that point, yeah, we are going to have a yield reduction because that's one of the components of yield, right? How many berries do we have on the head? And if you reduce the amount of berries, then all of a sudden you're reducing the amount of yield. So, but yeah, long and short of it is there wasn't a whole lot of crop that was up where we got cold enough, and where we did get cold enough, it didn't seem like we dropped down quite low enough or for long enough here in the early goings. But like I said, I took the preview beforehand to see what we looked like going in, and I'll do the post assessment here in the next couple of days to make sure that we're looking the way we did here over the weekend.
Yep. And if for some reason we would find something odd, we'll report back to the listeners, let them know what we did find as you evaluated. I think I'm going to be in good shape. I've gotten no phone calls. I certainly didn't. I guess I had one field of soybeans that I'm aware of that were close to coming up that a grower had as an experiment. But beyond that, I'm unaware of any crops that were up in my geography, and what little bit of wheat I've evaluated at this point, I don't think we're going to have any issues with as well. So,
excellent.
Carl, I think that, we'll call that kind of an episode here, I think, for today. A short one for the listeners, but we do hope that you are enjoying what we're putting out here. And with that, I will just make a call out. Every week we end the podcast with either our emails or with our social media handles and things like that. And just want to make sure that listeners understand how much we do appreciate their feedback. And if you've got ideas for a show topic, something you'd like us to talk about in very real time, or someone you'd like for us to talk to. And we've traditionally stayed within Pioneer. We've talked to some folks from Purdue and from some of the other universities as well. But if you've got an idea for someone you'd like for us to talk to on the podcast, to interview, to get a new take on something, please reach out to Carl, Ben, or myself through those social media channels and let us know so that we can provide you with the content that you want, that you're really interested in. We enjoy doing this, but we also understand that sometimes the three of us don't necessarily think like listeners, Carl. And so we want to make sure that we're covering all the bases and we're hitting the topics that folks find interesting. And so with that, I guess, if somebody wants to reach out to you for feedback or wants to talk about perhaps any of this temperature damage that we spoke about today, where can they get a hold of you at?
Yeah, you can find me on X at Joern and on Facebook at Joern Agronomy. And Brian, in the spirit of feedback, I guess I'd request the listeners to go ahead, give us a rating and a review. That's just one more way for folks to find us, or for us to find you, in a sense, here in the age of digital medium. So we'd really appreciate any feedback you have for us. And if you want to go ahead and follow along with Brian Shrader, Brian, how might they do so?
You can find me on Instagram at B_K_Shrader, I think is how that is. Had to think through that one again, Carl. So, all right. Well, we appreciate your time listening to us. We appreciate the feedback that you do provide to us. We hope that you're safe as you start through your planting season here, and we look forward to talking to you next week.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.